going to go ahead and get started. We still have some folks joining us. You are at the Partnership for Strong Communities, December IForum, Tenant-Based Subsidies in Connecticut and Equitable Expansion. We have some great speakers lined up here for today. I want to thank our sponsors you see there on the screen: Connecticut Department of Housing, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, and the Melville Charitable Trust. We are live tweeting at hashtag IForums 2020 or IForums 22. I should note, you can see that in the upper right hand corner of your screen. Go ahead, Danielle. So some housekeeping notes as we get started. I know most of you are all familiar with the Zoom webinar at this point, but this event is being recorded. It's going to be made available following the event on our website. So if you know someone else who would be interested in learning this information who missed it, or you want to go back and review information yourself, you'll be able to do that shortly. All attendees have entered muted. And please submit all questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel since we're in this format. So we're going to hold some time for question and answer at the end of both the initial keynote and the panel discussion. So save those questions till the very end, and we will reserve some time to go through them. Feel free to enter them as we move along, though, whenever they come to you. Next. You can also, as we noted, join the conversation, adding your personal experience anonymously if you like, using the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel. You can see how to do that here, and you can select send anonymously to do that. So for today, we are going to start with some brief opening remarks from me, just kind of setting the table for the conversation that we're having here. We're going to then turn it over to Suzanne Piacentini, our state HUD director here, who's going to give us an overview of subsidies, tenant-based subsidies, and what those look like in Connecticut. Then we're going to turn it over to a panel discussion. We have some great speakers lined up today. I will note, unfortunately, Steve DeLella won't be able to join us today. So we do have Michelle Molina with JD Amelia and Associates, who work with the Department of Housing, filling in for Steve to talk some about state subsidies. And then we'll finish with some question and answer and some closing remarks. For those of you who don't know, the Partnership for Strong Communities has been around since 1998, and we're dedicated to ensuring that everyone in Connecticut has a safe, stable home that's affordable to them in an equitable community of their choice. And we're committed to actively growing a culture of equity, growing and educating ourselves, and continuing to engage in race equity learning, identifying solutions to address systemic policies which reinforce disparities, respecting and listening to one another, and analyzing data through an equity lens. So I'm going to provide my remarks, and then we'll get going with Suzanne. So for those of you who live here in Connecticut, it comes as no surprise that we're in a growing housing crisis here, with more than 200,000 households finding themselves burdened by housing costs. And rent estimates show that only 42 units exist for every 100 extremely low-income households searching for them. And two recent studies show that we're short more than 86,000 units for low-income households here in Connecticut. Rents are up approximately 20% nationally over the past 2 years and 32% since 2017, with anecdotal evidence of recent increases as high as 50% in some Connecticut locations. However, median renter wages, according to our panelist Peggy Bailey's recent article, have only increased 3.2% since 2001. So we have a combination of increasing rents rising much faster than wages, and that's been exacerbated by the pandemic, as many of you know. Eviction rates are also climbing here in Connecticut, and for the first time in over a decade, so is homelessness. So while housing shortages and housing insecurity continue to grow, especially for those lowest income and disproportionately affecting BIPOC households, development costs continue to rise. Materials and labor are increasing, construction delays, especially for affordable housing development involving complicated capital stacks. All of this is hampering our ability to generate new housing units. And even when it is a more streamlined process, housing development in Connecticut can take years, with zoning and regulatory hurdles preventing quick movement. So what role do tenant-based subsidies play in easing our affordable housing needs and supporting low-income households? So tenant-based subsidies as we'll discuss, can include multiple different forms. And I think that's important to remember as we move through this presentation. We may say vouchers a lot, but there's lots of different types of tenant-based subsidies with different durations. So some, like EHV or rapid rehousing, can assist tenants with moving out of homelessness or achieving stability during challenging times. Others, like the state rental assistance program, or its better known federal counterpart, Housing Choice Voucher Program, or Section 8 vouchers as they're commonly known, can remain with a tenant for many years. And we know that empowering tenants with a mobile subsidy offers the best long-term outcomes, especially for families. And we'll hear more about that from our speakers and panelists today. And they're one of the best resources we have for helping households achieve housing and fiscal stability. They have the best track record for long-term success for families leaving homelessness. In many cases, they allow families to live where it makes sense for them, near jobs, childcare options, family, transit, easing other costs that frequently burden household budgets. Vouchers flex with household income. This is especially vital during the pandemic, where folks who lost employment opportunities were able to have their voucher recalculated to cover a larger portion of their rent. And more importantly, tenant-based subsidies frequently don't tie a household to a particular building. They most often leave a family to make a choice and decide that they want to go take a new job or move closer to family. And they don't have to choose between those options and losing their subsidized housing as they may in a brick or mortar project situation. So how have vouchers been performing in recent market conditions? And in a word, it's relationship status complicated, and it has been for many years. You may have seen an article by Jackie Robb Thomas recently on CT Insider, which detailed some of the well-known concerns around the voucher program and market. It's probably not a surprise to many of you here today that wait lists are open rarely and are years long in some places. The market has made leasing up hard as fair market rents keep up with the fast moving market. There simply aren't enough vouchers to go around, with only 1 in 4 households needing housing subsidy being able to access it nationally. And some states like Connecticut suffer from a lack of units, period. You can't use a voucher if you can't find a rental unit. And Peggy's recent article that I mentioned about rental assistance and expanding unit creation is a source for more information on that, and we'll get into more of that later. Lack of sufficient housing navigation and mobility counseling resources continues to hamper tenants' ability to identify units. And some PHAs place conditions on or limit voucher mobility, thwarting one of the best features of a voucher or a tenant-based subsidy. Challenges with unit inspections and other delays can inhibit lease-ups and prevent some landlords from participating with tenant-based subsidy programs. And although source of income discrimination, while illegal here in Connecticut, remains an ongoing and largely unreported challenge. So let's learn more about tenant-based subsidies. So what are they exactly and how do they work here in Connecticut? We'll ask more about what's the talk at the federal level about the role of vouchers in easing our national affordable housing shortage and ending homelessness. How can we overcome some of the challenges with these types of subsidies and help more families achieve housing stability? And how do we ensure that tenant-based subsidies are distributed equitably and reduce rather than perpetuate racial disparities and segregation that persist in Connecticut's housing space? So I'm happy here today to have our wonderful State HUD Director, Suzanne Piacentini, joining us to share some more information. For those of you who don't know Suzanne, she has over 35 years of experience at HUD, and prior to serving as HUD's Connecticut Field Office Director, she served as the Director of Multifamily Housing, where she oversaw asset management and development. She's also a member of HUD's National Disaster Leadership Cadre, serving most recently in Florida after Hurricane Ian, and she also spent quite a bit of time in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. So she has lots of experience seeing families in crisis situations and challenging situations and identifying stability. She's received many awards, several from the Connecticut Federal Executive Association, the Chair Award, Manager of the Year Award, and to many of you, she needs no introduction. So with that, I will turn it over to Suzanne to talk more about tenant-based subsidies. Thanks for joining us, Suzanne.
Thank you, Kylie. I have to apologize to the audience. I tried to call into Zoom. I'm still in Florida, and my computer is not cooperating, but luckily my trusty phone is. So on behalf of the Connecticut HUD office, I just want to thank my colleagues presenting today, as well as the Partnership for Strong Communities for continuing their very popular IForum series. It always brings us current, relevant information on topics related to affordable housing in our communities. And I just thank them for including HUD today. I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. It's known popularly as Section 8. If you're old like me, Finders Keepers or Certificate Program, or my favorite, when you have someone calling you, I have HUD, and then it's a great mystery to try to figure out how we can help them. When Congress first established Section 8 of the Housing and Community Development Act in 1974, one of the goals was to make sure people with lower incomes could find decent housing and a suitable living environment outside of public housing units. When this was established, we really only had public housing units and subsidized multifamily. And as you know, people would come and go, the subsidy would stay with the unit. The voucher program was administered by HUD, and we operated in Connecticut with the help of our local public housing agency partners, and that includes the state of Connecticut and 44 local public housing agencies. It is the largest federal low-income housing program today. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Along with Section 8 vouchers, we also have other forms of subsidy in Connecticut. And while the number may seem large, close to 100,000, it is by no means adequate for the need we have in Connecticut. Again, the numbers are on here, but we subsidize through our multifamily project-based relationships with private owners. We still have traditional low-income public housing, although that number continues to dwindle as our housing authorities aggressively have updated or rebuilt their housing, and then the voucher number grows as a result of that as well. We also have a program called HOME, where we can project-based subsidies through our communities that receive home funds, as well as tenant-based, and those units are included in this total as well. Next slide. Program overview. Okay, I'm going to try to distill a somewhat complex program down to a few easy lines here. As you know, it's a government program assisting very low-income families, the elderly, and the disabled to afford decent, safe, and sanitary housing in the private market. The family or individual find their own housing, including single-family homes, townhouses, apartments. Again, the housing authorities are our partners in delivering this program on the ground. The housing authority then signs, when an apartment is located, a subsidy contract with the landlord directly on behalf of the recipient. The family pays the difference between the actual rent charged and approved by the landlord and the amount subsidized by the program. The owner has a lease with the tenant and a relationship with the housing authority for the subsidy. Next slide, please. The relationships. This is just what I just described. There's HUD. We're funding the PHA for their subsidies through the Section 8 program. They have a contract with the owner. The family has a lease with the owner, and the PHA has a relationship with the family. These relationships are often brokered by case managers. They're by people in the community that help. It's not easy, as Kylie alluded to, for residents to find units and to negotiate rents. So we do try to help through our PHAs as much as possible with that relationship. Next slide. Kylie wanted us to talk a little bit about some voucher facts. Eligible families can make up to 80% of AMI. Across the country, 30% of the households served are elderly. In Connecticut, the average time, based on sort of our anecdotal surveys of our housing authorities, that family spends on the program, 8.75 years. And as Kylie alluded to, waiting lists can equal that or exceed that to just even get on the program. In the last few years, we have used targeting through special vouchers. And these are to help people who give them sort of a leg up within the general community to receive vouchers. And these are for people facing homelessness, people with disabilities, youth aging out of foster care, our homeless veterans. And we also have special programs where housing authorities can work with a resident who has a voucher to purchase a house and use that voucher to help with the monthly mortgage payments. Next slide. We talked a little bit about finding housing and how difficult that has been in Connecticut and really across the country. The pandemic did not help our situation, and we just really have a lot, in Connecticut in particular, just years of not building enough housing to keep up with our need, and it makes it very difficult for our voucher holders to locate units. Again, once a Section 8 voucher is issued, the PHA provides 60 days to obtain housing. They offer extensions. Vouchers can be portable, which means they can take that voucher, the family received it from Housing Authority A, and move into the jurisdiction of Housing Authority B. Housing authorities are allowed to require that the voucher holders live in their jurisdiction for 1 year before they can port out. Even if that rule does exist, if there's a reasonable accommodation needed for a family, that can be considered on a case-by-case basis to port earlier in the relationship. Next slide. I think many of you know this already, but rent, or the total tenant payment, is based on the family's anticipated gross annual income, less allowed deductions, and those vary by family or elderly. The total tenant payment can be decreased or increased based on tenant's income, and we try to always advise tenants who call, and as they recertify with the housing authorities, to report in changes of income. Oftentimes, folks don't understand that part of the process, and they end up in a situation where their income drops and they can no longer afford the program. And if the tenant payment drops, we increase our housing assistance payments from HUD. So what is the value of an HCV? And I'm not talking about like the value to people looking for housing, but how do we determine how much it's worth, so to speak? The value is determined by the PHA and is based on the existing fair market rents, with any exceptions that housing authority may have in force. We publish FMRs annually by HUD. There's a resource page at the end of my presentation which lists all these links. The PHA sets a value at between 90 and 110% or 120 with waivers of the FMR for the appropriate unit or voucher size, and it's called the payment standard. And they update these annually. Next slide. As an example, the payment standard of a 2-bedroom apartment is $2,000, and say the adjusted household income is $1,000. The PHA will then pay a maximum of $1,700 because the resident will be paying 30% of their adjusted gross income. So this PHA would then be maximum allowed to present $1,700 to that landlord. Wanted to talk about distributions. We have 51 federal housing authorities in Connecticut, 44 of which, along with the state of Connecticut, participate in our program. The units that each housing authority has under annual contributions contract is listed. This is a total maximum number of vouchers we could ever have in force in Connecticut. However, I have to caution you that this program is controlled not only by the units we have a contract for, but also the budget authority that a housing authority has been allocated. So if they are paying well above the payment standard or well above the FMR, they may in fact be able to only put, instead of 811 vouchers on the street, maybe they can only afford 800. Or based on the number of people they serve in the household, if they're serving much larger households, again, it may be a number under what we have under contract with them. Special purpose vouchers have really become a good tool to meet the needs of special populations. Again, I mentioned these earlier. We have non-elderly disabled, family unification program, Veterans Affairs supportive housing called VASH, mainstream vouchers. We can project-based vouchers to a property, home ownership vouchers, and during the pandemic, emergency housing vouchers. Next slide. Again, we wanted to talk about where certain vouchers are located, and the next few slides will provide the information as to where special purpose vouchers are located by housing authority. So the first one is for the non-elderly disabled. Next slide. The family unification program vouchers, and those vouchers are made available in cooperation with the State Department of Children and Families. And those are really for families who, but for suitable housing, may not have custody of their children. And those are selected through the state of Connecticut and have really been a popular program for us. The next is our VASH, which are our Veteran Supportive Housing Vouchers, and these are in conjunction with the Veterans Administration. We work closely with them and our housing authorities. The Veterans Administration brings the housing authority the clients who meet the eligibility standards, and these are then administered by the local housing authority. We have mainstream vouchers as we try to incorporate populations into the mainstream, giving them a leg up in trying to get vouchers. I also want to talk a little bit about PBVs, because here through this conversation, we've been talking about how mobile vouchers are. But in areas of the country, in particular where costs are high or units aren't available, we have a program that helps create units that are affordable. And those are the project-based vouchers. And in many cases, we have used this tool incredibly well in Connecticut as we renovate old public housing. We use a new financing model, and we support some of that income stream in the new financing model by allowing housing authorities to project-based vouchers, so a guaranteed income stream to a property. And these are the least ones that are least across the state. We don't allow 100% of a housing authority to project-based. That would sort of defeat the mobility portion of this program. But it has been an incredible tool where there is not enough housing stock or not enough good housing stock. As new units are developed, it gives people an option. A resident, after a year of living in a project-based voucher, if they decide that they would like to have a mobile voucher, that can be exchanged as they become available at the housing authority. So it's really, again, been a fantastic development tool in Connecticut. Next slide. Vouchers can also be used for people who are willing to step up to the next stage in life and want to own a house. Housing authorities can opt to run a home ownership program. And it really allows a housing authority to make monthly housing assistance payments through the voucher to a first-time home buyer to assist in meeting their monthly home ownership expenses. It's considered a special type of voucher, so housing authorities do not have to run this program. It also should include some housing counseling and assistance in locating financing. These are not easy transactions, but they are incredibly wonderful for the families who can take advantage of that. Next slide. The housing authorities that are currently in this year running a home ownership voucher program or have existing homeowners that they're still participating are listed below. And again, it's not a huge percentage of people in a high cost state like Connecticut. It's even with the help of a voucher, it makes home ownership very difficult, but it is out there for those residents who can locate a home in their price range and have a voucher and want to take that next step. So it's just one more option. Lastly, I want to talk about emergency housing vouchers. These were authorized through the pandemic, and they really were intended to meet certain populations, people who are currently homeless, those folks who are at risk of homelessness, recently homeless, attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, or have a high risk of housing instability. The next slide shows that Connecticut has really done an incredible job. And I credit all the housing authorities here, as well as the partners through the continuums of care and the communities where these vouchers are located. Our EHV leasing utilization is one of the highest in the nation. And we have the city of Hartford and Norwich both at 100%. It really is kudos to these housing authorities and their community partners working on behalf of residents. Next slide. I just included, I think the partnership will share these slides, links to some HUD resources, Housing Choice Voucher fact sheets, the homeownership guidebook, a listing of these local housing authorities, income limits, and fair market rents. And on the last slide, contacts for both myself, I'm the field office director, and Jennifer Gottlieb-Elazari, who's our Connecticut Public Housing Director. And that's the end of just sort of a little bit of voucher taste for Connecticut.
That was some great information, Suzanne. I think one of the points that you underscored that I think is important for folks to remember from a state budgeting standpoint and otherwise is that vouchers that housing authorities issue aren't a set number of vouchers. It's really an allocated pool. And so as we've seen rents increase, we're less able to serve people with the same amount of money. And that's been one of the sort of challenges that I know folks have been facing in the market, but that was a lot of great data and some great resources there on the slide. And the slides, as I noted earlier, will be available. We'll be posting this recording on our website and on our YouTube channel. So happy to share those resources out to you directly if you want to contact the partnership. If you have questions for Suzanne, please put them in the Q&A box. We're going to get to them at the end of our panel discussion, which I'm going to move into now. And one of our panelists, I know Michelle, will be joining us in a couple of moments. So I'm going to ask each of our three panelists, you see their names here on the screen, to introduce themselves, starting with Peggy, and then Felicia, and then we'll go to Michelle. Welcome, Peggy. Thanks for joining us today.
No problem. Thanks, Kylie. And hello, everyone. My name is Peggy Bailey. I am the Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I just came back to the center in July after serving for 18 months as Secretary Fudge's Senior Advisor on Rental Assistance, which was the thrill of a lifetime. And I had such a great time working in the administration. Before going into the administration, I served on the Biden-Harris transition team and had been at the center since 2016. And most recently, before going to the transition team, was the Vice President for Housing Policy. We recently at the center combined our housing team and our family income support team to become the housing and income security team, with the recognition, as Kylie mentioned, of that what we're solving for is the fact that people don't make enough money either through their jobs or through benefits to be able to afford a place to live. So bringing together the housing and income staff, I think, will really help us focus on both helping make sure that people are stably housed, while also recognizing that they still need resources to be able to make ends meet month to month. So with that, I'll pass it to Felicia.
Good morning, and thank you for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Felicia Adams, and I'm a Senior Program Manager with the Corporation for Supportive Housing. Before my role here, I was the Executive Director of the Stonington Housing Authority, which is a small public housing authority here in Connecticut, and we provide affordable housing to seniors and disabled adults.
Thanks, Felicia. And Michelle, are you able to join us yet?
Mute. Yes. Hi. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, a little last minute for me. Steve was supposed to be here, but unfortunately, there's a lot of illnesses going throughout the state of Connecticut as we speak. And I'm at a training, but I'm jumping in to help out. Once again, Michelle Molina. I'm the program director for J.D. Amelia and Associates. We're contracted out by the state of Connecticut Department of Housing to administer their statewide Section 8 voucher program, as well as the statewide RAP program, which is a piggyback program off of Section 8 that affords our Connecticut residents with subsidies. I've been doing this for about 32 years. And I'm happy to be here and hopefully answer some questions and add some guidance where needed.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Michelle. Just to clarify too, for folks who don't know, the RAP program here in Connecticut works very similarly to the Section 8 Federal Housing Choice Voucher program. There's some differences between the two, but largely they operate very similarly. And so for folks tuning in from Connecticut and interested in what might be happening with the legislative session, I think it's important to just note that those two programs are very similar in nature. And so when we talk about housing vouchers here in Connecticut, we're often talking about both federal Section 8 tenant-based subsidies, as well as in project basis, Suzanne noted, and our RAP program. So with that, I'm going to start throwing out some questions. I'm going to start with Peggy. Peggy, you just authored a really excellent article about expanding tenant-based subsidies and the challenges with finding units and availability, as well as some other really valuable data, some of which I shared about income gaps, and there's some great stuff in there too about racial disparities. So, but you and I know too that, as Suzanne noted, that there's some great evidence to support the positive benefits to individuals and families who are lucky enough to win the voucher lottery. And so I want to start kind of at the 30,000 foot view. What's the benefit to an individual or family who's able to get a tenant-based subsidy? What do we know at the national level for those families and households in terms of outcomes?
No, I appreciate this question, because what I strongly believe that we don't talk about, we complain about all the problems and the issues and lack of funding, but the place to start is the success and why people, why we need more vouchers, because we know that that it helps family, it solves housing, right? We know that homelessness and housing instability are a housing problem, and therefore we need to first and foremost put housing resources toward it. The best and most rigorous study that shows this is the Family Options Study, which has 3 parts. The first part it was published in 2015, 2016, and it looked at families that received housing assistance, permanent housing assistance, families that received rapid rehousing, and families that were placed in transitional shelter. And it overwhelmingly shows that families that received a housing voucher were their housing instability was solved and better than the other interventions that families might have received compared to the usual care group. The families receiving a voucher had a 50% increase in their housing stability compared to families that received usual care. And so, you know, we know, and we also know that there are other pieces of the puzzle that vouchers put together for families. Being able to solve the housing affordability problem gives families a foundation to be able to improve their health, improve children's outcomes in school, and generally and help families be able to afford the other things that they need, like food, healthcare, and school supplies, all the things that come up. And so that's the understanding the value that housing vouchers have for families is definitely the place to start when it comes to what should we be doing to solve for homelessness and especially extremely low income families' inability to afford housing. I think another thing that that's important to mention, soon we'll be releasing some data analysis we've done looking at rents and incomes for families. And what we've seen is, while we know that rents are going up, that's like the headline in the news, when you tease out who rents are going up the most for, it is insane how the increase, when you stabilize for inflation, and inflation is about 6% across the board when it comes to rent increases. Housing for people making less than $15,000 a year has increased another almost 6.5% above that for above inflation. But for other incomes, it's much lower. And then when you get to people making over $75,000 a year, rents actually haven't kept up with inflation. And what we know about that is the people of color are overrepresented among those low income, that lowest income bracket. And when you look at that lowest income bracket and tease out for families with children and families without children, the families with children's rent has also increased at a much higher rate than families without children. So, you know, when you look at the success of the voucher program on top of the need that's been put in place because of rising rents, it's a no-brainer that we need to increase rental assistance for families.
Agreed. We'll take that a step further and sort of talk about the benefits to families sort of at the ground level as you've seen it. And Felicia, you're the Stonington Housing Authority isn't a voucher issuing housing authority, but you've spent a lot of time counseling families through the housing navigation process and assisting families sort of struggling at this level. Can you talk a little bit about what's sort of the stability that comes to folks? So what are the benefits that you've seen in those households you've worked with who are able to who are able to obtain a tenant-based subsidy, or in your case, maybe gonna get an affordable unit through you?
Yes, so, as we know, the voucher program was designed to help low-income families access decent, safe, and affordable homes, and to move out of areas of high poverty concentration. So what I've observed is that when a wait list opens for a voucher program, there's a lot of people that show interest and want to apply. And when they need help with that application process, as a landlord, I recognize the value and the long-term benefits to, my residents. So I would help them navigate that process, help them gather whatever paperwork they needed to be able to get on the wait list. And then even as they, came off of the wait list and were issued vouchers, I would help them to navigate that process. It is time intensive. It requires a lot of paperwork. And sometimes people just don't have the bandwidth to take that on by themselves. Like we all do, they have lives, they have jobs, they have family issues that they're dealing with, and they just need a bit of extra help. So even though the Stonington Housing Authority is not a voucher issuing PHA, we help them access the voucher, navigate the process, and then even help them through lease up. One thing that I would always ask my tenants once they got the voucher is, well, now that you have some of your income freed up, what's next? What are you going to do with that extra money? Because voucher tenants only pay 30% of their income towards their rent. Commonly, I would hear, I'm going to get dental insurance. This is something that is a luxury for people on a fixed income. And sometimes we tend to take that for granted. But getting dental insurance would be a goal. I had a tenant who said, now I'm going to get my car fixed. Having a voucher was able to give him the additional income he needed to increase his quality of life. We were in a community that just didn't have great public transportation. It's available 5 days a week. And so having that extra money to get his car fixed really impacted his quality of life.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to hear those voices of tenants through you, Felicia. I think it's really important for folks to remember that while it may seem like a relatively small amount of money, sometimes that couple $100 a month is a huge difference for folks. And to Peggy's standpoint, it really allows that boost that we see in the academic data about healthcare outcomes or outcomes for children or access to jobs and job stability that is so beneficial for families and maintaining housing stability and also growing their household financial stability. Michelle, how about you? What have you seen from your perspective in working with tenants and overseeing both Section 8 vouchers and the state WRAP program? What do you see are the positive outcomes with tenant-based subsidies?
Well, I will piggyback off of Peggy and Felicia. We have seen that the expansion of need for affordable housing is definitely there. I really hate to always say pre-COVID, post-COVID, but COVID has really changed our industry dramatically, and I'm sure nationwide everybody is seeing the effects of the housing market, and that's not just from single family purchases, but it's also from renting. So those individuals previously that were, ELI, extremely low income, now we're finding that the very low and low income households can't afford the rents. So as they come up to the top of the waiting list, the subsidy is a greater need for all across the board. It's not just, our dedicated, very low income households because of the rise in the market. We've also seen that when waiting lists are opened, especially for our agency on behalf of the Department of Housing, we're seeing that the numbers of individuals applying for housing is astronomically high. The last time we opened up the waiting list, we received over 86,000 pre-applications. And we can't even fathom what that number may look like when we open the list up again in the near future. That will probably be in the 100,000, 200,000 because of the diversity of income levels based off of the rise in the rental market. So I think the need for those vouchers, I was in and out when Suzanne was giving her presentation, but she did make mention of the EHV, emergency housing vouchers, which we did receive an allocation from HUD. We have seen that those have added such a positive aspect to the specific clientele that they are supposed to be supporting, like our most vulnerable homeless, victims of domestic violence or stalking, because they have never had that peace, meaning the piece of the hierarchy of a roof over their head. And this has afforded them that opportunity. It's difficult for some people, as we have seen, because they're in difficult circumstances, but for those that have embraced these new vouchers, we see that they are, we're coming on the first year rolling around already, and we're seeing that they're prospering and they're getting a little more settled, a little more sufficient. Their home life is a little better. I recall Peggy mentioning the fact that, it's not just the housing piece, it's the education, it's the work, it's the transportation, it's the childcare. All of those are starting to roll into place for these extremely vulnerable families. And the same go for the VASH program, the Veterans Administration program. We see that it takes a little bit longer than a year. We're seeing that 18 months, 2 years, even on that third year is really when they become whole and solid. And these subsidy programs assist them in getting to a standardized level to just be able to, in a whole, have a household that can engage in other elements because they have affordable housing. We all know that most of our paychecks go toward our rent or our mortgage or the fact of having a roof over our head. So I really think that these have added some wonderful attributes to our participants out there in the communities.
Yeah. As interesting as each of you talked about the benefits with tenant-based subsidies, you also touched upon the challenges, and I want to get back to the challenges. But Michelle, you talked about EHV, emergency housing vouchers, and the pandemic response, and the increase that we saw in tenant-based subsidies through the pandemic. And I wanted to use some of our time today to talk about what that looked like and what we learned from the distribution of emergency tenant-based rental assistance throughout the pandemic, and how we can potentially carry that forward. And then I want to get back to how Connecticut did with that. But first, let's start with Peggy on that question. Peggy, from a sort of a national perch, what do you think that we learned from the provision of additional tenant-based rental subsidies, including EHV, over the course of the COVID emergency crisis?
So I think the first thing that we learned is that we can house people quickly when we have the resources to do it. Despite the challenges, which we will all get to, right? We have seen record lease up given with the emergency housing voucher program. The second piece that that I think we're learning from is the flexibility that that HUD, don't work at HUD anymore, that HUD was able to supply with that program, given the statutory flexibility that Congress put within that program. So things like being able to house people and get the documentation together afterwards, being able to the partnerships between housing authorities and continuums of care to greatly strengthen those partnerships. And the administrative fee and service fee structure that HUD implemented that came along with EHVs showed us that, folks were listening at HUD on the things that we have learned from best practices and the needs of PHAs to be able to pay PHAs up front, so that they could lean in to being more of a service-oriented and proactive actor in helping people find housing, rather than simply leaning back and being an administrator of a program. And I'm hoping that's something in particular that we can lean into, because as Felicia said, finding housing is tough. And a lot of us have the resources to hire professionals to help us find housing. Some of the best practices out of EHV from around the country are PHAs being able to hire real estate agents to help people find housing and connect with landlords. So those are just some of the things that I think and I think and then the last bit is not only are we leasing up people, but we're able to, but they're staying housed, and they're good tenants, and that we should be doing, and that, a lot of the myths that we have that frankly come out of racism and discrimination of people of color and people who are low income are being thwarted, which is fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. I'm going to get back to Felicia in a minute, but Michelle, you helped administer some of those the new COVID resources that came through the Department of Housing. So maybe channeling Steve a little bit and putting on your sort of policy side hat from your perspective. What did things look like on the ground level in terms of administering those new vouchers and those new tenant-based subsidies? And does that match with what you're hearing from Peggy from the national level in terms of what we've learned from EHV and similar resources?
Yes, so absolutely. I can confirm that Peggy's comments are pretty truthful here in the state of Connecticut. We received 380 emergency housing vouchers, and simultaneous through our state WRAP program, we did clear the family shelters as well, another 250 subsidies. So we were utilizing both programs at the same time to try and get individuals out of the shelters. That was the primary focus for the rental assistance program, and the EHV program, of course, gaining that relationship with the COCs. And here in Connecticut, we have the CANs, coordinated access networks, and there's 5 different headquarters throughout the state. So at JD Amelia and Associates, we had to really firm up those relationships, which has been a wonderful attribute because now we could utilize those relationships in other fields, in other clients' cases, and and some of our hard to house. But we also did a mobility piece with our EHVs where we utilized the state's mobility team to also assist. We didn't hire real estates, which I think is a really wonderful idea, to use those preliminary fees and service fees for that reason. But we did have, the team of the mobility, but the caseworkers from the CANs, they just stepped right in and partnered up with staff that I hired, which was also, as Peggy mentioned, those upfront fees. I think that, we lose sight of that with our regular voucher program coming off of the waiting list because we can't dedicate, my staff can't dedicate as much time because we don't have the resources. Our admin fees are going to pay for our staff, and to get preliminary fees for this specific program, I was able to hire somebody immediately, get this, the computer, get the materials, necessities that were required for her to just jump in and catch right up. Because a lot of what we do is the initial eligibility piece. And also, I agree as well with what Peggy said about waiving some of those statutory requirements. I mean, people coming from the situations that they came from for the EHV program, they didn't have birth certificates on hand. You know, they didn't have social security, you know, cards on hand, which is typically a normal mandate under our regular HUD programs. So that flexibility in obtaining those documents after the fact really assisted with us, you know, sparking up the ground and getting them housed and into suitable units and out of the, you know, uncomfortable situations that they were in. And we pretty much piggybacked that with our RAP program, with our emptying the family shelters. We did the same. We weren't as nitpicky. Oh, you don't have this birth certificate, well, you're on hold. No, we, you know, pursued and housed, which was the ultimate goal, to get a roof over their head and obtain the information after the fact.
Would be good if we could keep that going.
Yes,
Another,
I think all PHAs would love that. Peggy, knock that down, please.
you're right. You're all there to house folks first. So we spent a good time talking about all the benefits that tenant-based subsidies have had, as well as some of the good lessons that we learned from EHV. Let's delve into some of the challenges and then get into some of the racial equity space. But first, what are some of the challenges from the end user perspective? And Felicia, you talked about some of the challenges, particularly in the application process, and we've touched on the wait list process. What else do you see in your experience in working with households in terms of the biggest challenges that folks who are lucky enough to receive a subsidy run into?
One of the most immediate challenges that subsidy recipients encounter is the paperwork. Typically, they'll get a letter and then a stack of paperwork that they need to complete, and they have a deadline to return it to the PHA. It's the paper, I'm used to seeing it because, you know, as a landlord, I'm working for a PHA, I understand the language and I understand how to fill out some of those forms. But as a voucher recipient, it's complicated and they need assistance. Secondly, finding a landlord that's willing to accept the voucher. In Connecticut, we are lucky enough that a voucher is considered a source of income, and that is a protected class. But voucher recipients are typically household with children, typically Black and Latino, and those are all protected classes. And so that is just another barrier when they are going to, you know, meet a landlord about a potential rental. Additionally, sometimes they want to move to a community that's considered high opportunity, to access quality schools, to access good public transportation or jobs. And then the value of the voucher just hasn't kept pace with the rental market. Throughout COVID, you know, like you said, Kylie, rents have just skyrocketed. And we have very low vacancy, rental vacancy here in Connecticut. Nationwide, the average is about 6% rental vacancy, but here in Connecticut, it's closer to 2%. So with these issues compounding, you know, not enough affordable units, not enough units in general, and then a voucher that hasn't kept pace with the market, it makes it tough for those people who have a voucher to, you know, access quality housing in a community that they want to live in.
Peggy, Michelle, what about you? What do you think are the biggest challenges for those lucky enough to receive a tenant-based subsidy? Feel free to jump in either.
I agree with Felicia. I mean, from the start, the paperwork, once again, you know, with the specialty programs, it afforded the individuals the opportunity to have assistance with filling out the paperwork, which can be cumbersome, absolutely, from start to finish, even supplying the request for tenancy approval, you know, application to that process. very difficult for some people to comprehend and to understand, with the, special fees that we received for the special programs, that was part of the assistance, was to assist them with that. Under the regular HCV program, it's not there. There's no preliminary fees, so that assistance is limited, especially when, you're drowning the market and you're sending 500 applications out at once. A receptionist can't answer every single question, on 10 pages of an application. So yes, definitely a barrier, the paperwork and the cumbersomeness of it. Secondly, it's the housing market. We were fortunate that we were able to get the HUD waiver as part of the COVID release from HUD. We were approved for 120% of the fair market rent to adopt as our payment standard throughout the 2022, this past year, which really helped us. It hurt other PHAs that didn't in Connecticut go for the waiver, but it did assist us because we were at a little bit higher of a rental schedule where it was within the market, but still not quite there. Which then brought obstacles on to staff like myself and higher senior managers, because we had to go to HUD for exception payment standards over the 120%, which is, as a accommodation, which can also be cumbersome. I also feel that with regards to the market, and as Felicia said, we have a 2% vacancy rate. The competition, what I have heard from the different outreaches that I have done with Connecticut landlord associations, real estate associations, and just your mom and pops out there that own property, is they have like an 8-to-1 ratio. They have 8 people coming in looking at a unit for one vacant unit. So of course they're going to go through that list, and maybe our participant isn't the most desirable. So we had to encounter those challenges to try and convince that maybe it's a better opportunity because you're guaranteed a portion of the rent. Had to have multiple conversations with property owners to get them in sync with that competition of so many people out there looking for the same unit. It still is. I do have to give HUD a lot of credit on this call, because the fair market rents that were just published in October did increase, and they used a new methodology in determining those fair market rents. And I thank all of those, if anyone's on the call, that did that, because it's extremely helpful for PHAs out there administering these programs. Are they still a little low? Yes. But are they at least there? Yes. So it's helping and lessening that challenge a little bit, but I think it's the vacancy and the lack of units, rental units out there in the communities, that is really the biggest, feat that we have to conquer.
And I would just add one other issue for that voucher recipients face, and that's the geographic boundaries of the PHAs. And the challenges when PHAs don't work together because a lot of times it's not intuitive to the voucher recipient where the boundaries are of where they can use their voucher, and it just creates another hurdle. So looking at ways to be able to work across jurisdictions is particularly important, and I think. I've at least nationally, there are great examples that this is another place where EHVs have been helpful because of the geographical difference between the continuums of care and the PHAs. Continuums of care have the EHVs have driven PHAs coming up with the same application process and the same and ways to work together that are through the same portal, but being able to access, the COC being able to access multiple PHAs in the same way. And hopefully we can take some of those lessons and apply them to the bigger programs as well.
Yeah, and I see some questions coming in about, what can we do to start working on some of these challenges? Some of these are newer challenges. I think with the market and the vacancy rate being what they are, that's exacerbated challenges or created new ones. And to Peggy's standpoint, to Peggy's point, the challenges with PHA boundaries is something that existed before the market changes. I want to get back to suggested solutions. I want to talk first, though, about racial equity in vouchers. And particularly, we know that Peggy detailed this in the beginning too, that racial disparities persist among those who are housing insecure. What are we doing at the state, but Peggy, for your sake, the federal level, to help ensure that tenant subsidies are supporting users and helping to reverse racial disparities as opposed to perpetuating them?
So the first piece is just to name that this happens, right? And early on in the administration, there were a few executive orders that directed HUD to look at racial disparities and ways that that HUD and other federal agencies could address some of the inherent bias that exists. And the ways that federal programs can perpetuate racial discrimination. I think I think the EHV program is an interesting example because there are flexibilities, and I would also say the emergency rental assistance program are both ways that either the federal government, so in the case of the emergency rental assistance program that was run through the Department of Treasury, or the emergency housing voucher program through HUD, both leaned into the flexibilities that Congress gave the federal government in administering those programs. But what I am particularly concerned about, at least in the early data, shows that that a lot of programs did not lean into that flexibility. And you can't say that racism and bias of low-income people didn't play into the reasons why providers and government entities didn't lean into the flexibilities. Concerns about I would say over concerns about fraud, not trusting people to tell them the truth. Other things that on their face you could say are innocent concerns to have about people accessing resources, but underlying that are bias against low-income people, racism and discriminatory, and a history of creating creating hoops that families have to jump through in order to deserve to be able to receive benefits. And so I think, this is a case where the federal government provided the flexibilities that we have all screamed about and wanted. But then when push came to shove, people found reasons not to do them. And as I said, a lot of those reasons are rooted in racism and bias.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. Felicia or Michelle, did you want to weigh in on that on the state side? Is there, how do you feel that racial disparities have been addressed with the voucher program, or not addressed as it may be, as Peggy detailed, federal level? How do you see perhaps discrimination playing, racial discrimination, but also family discrimination? We've seen other types of discrimination play out against voucher holders here in Connecticut.
Again, to piggyback off what Peggy said, that's really difficult to determine because it's not always very clear that it's racial discrimination. Landlords can, say a variety of reasons of why they choose not to participate in the voucher program. And one concern that I've heard from landlords is that there's too much paperwork, or there are too many inspections, or it takes too much time to lease up. But, moving forward, if there are ways to better engage and educate landlords about the process so that those are no longer barriers to them accepting voucher applicants to their rentals, that could be helpful.
And if I could just jump in real quick, there's an important point that I think we should make when recruiting landlords into the voucher program. One, are the lessons we learned during the pandemic about ways to streamline the inspection process, and can we figure out ways to continue some of those things moving forward? But also, one of my funny story for myself was I was going to my regular hairdresser, and the woman who was in front of me, Rebecca, who I've seen for years, we hadn't seen each other much during the pandemic because we had, our hairdresser was spacing out appointments. This was probably like a year ago. So, and she didn't know what I did at that time. I was at HUD, but she didn't know that. She just knew I worked on housing, and she is a landlord in Northwest Maryland. And she was talking about all these trips that she'd gone on during the pandemic because everything was so cheap. And I was like, oh, well, Rebecca, did you have any trouble with tenants paying their rent? And she's like, oh, no, all of my tenants are voucher holders. So they all paid their rent because I get the subsidy. And some of them had a little trouble with their part of the rent, but I worked with them or whatever. And it was fine. And she's like, I only had to evict one person, but it was because he wouldn't talk to me. And I couldn't figure, and it was before the emergency rental assistance dollars were out. And but out of, I think she has like 15 rentals, she only had issues with one, and she was able to carry on with her normal life because the rent was getting paid. And that's a story that we don't tell enough. And I think we need to start to the landlords that we know that are a part of the program, we need to rally them to talk about what successes they saw during the pandemic and how they got paid during the pandemic, or were able to work with the emergency rental assistance program in the places that didn't discriminate against HUD assisted households to be able to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, thanks. And you answered one of my other questions I was going to get into about what are the sort of benefits and challenges to landlords in leasing up. And I think that consistent income is one of the biggest benefits, and one that we don't often tout and talk about. And particularly in the pandemic, we saw that households who had vouchers didn't need to partake in the Unite CT program we had here in that rental relief program, because they were able to go through income certification again and have their voucher adjusted to cover a larger portion of their rent, versus have to go seek and work with their landlord and have the landlord submit more documentation and all of that to obtain the additional rental assistance. So that is something we don't talk about. And to Felicia's point, tying it back to the racial equity work, where we can eliminate all those barriers, we still get back to a place where there's going to be discrimination on the basis of race or family and disability. We see that all the time here. But source of income discrimination, to note one of the questions in the chat, is a protected class here in Connecticut. So you cannot be voucher income is treated as a source of income. So a landlord can't refuse to take a voucher as a source of income here in the state of Connecticut, which isn't the case all over the country, which leads me to, I think, what will be our last question. Then I'm going to try to pivot to some more of the Q&A. What can Connecticut learn from innovations in voucher use in places outside of Connecticut? And while Michelle and Felicia, you worked in the state, I know both of you pay attention to, both at your perch at CSH and Michelle in your space in the voucher world, to what's happening with vouchers in other spaces, and you're talking to other states. And Peggy, you've seen this too. What, from a federal perspective, what are some of the innovations you've seen other states doing with vouchers that you think could be of interest to Connecticut or should be replicated in more states? I guess I'll start with Peggy on this one, and then let's go back to the state space.
So just the one thing that I think I would mention is creating landlord incentive pools. So, is one piece, but it's really important to have both carrots and sticks that help enforce the source of income. And one of the things that I think one of the innovations I think works, and Urban Institute has done some analysis of this, of Oregon's program in this space, is creating landlord incentive pools. So what that is using local or state resources to create just a little pool of dollars that are available if landlords need minor repairs because of the inspection, or they need to like repaint or carpet or something like that when a tenant leaves. One, it provides landlords this extra benefit of being able to participate in the program. And two, what at least what Urban Institute has found when they've studied these is that it's really inexpensive to run because, one, voucher tenants are just like every other tenant. They don't destroy property at any other accelerated rate. Generally, what you're doing is creating this pool of dollars that alleviates one of the excuses that landlords use to not participate in the program. So it's usually a win-win. So that's the one thing that I would mention.
Michelle, anything you want to add, or Felicia, any innovations that you think would be worth bringing to the state?
So we did do an innovative pool. You know, we're fortunate, you know, and we do differ from many other PHAs because our jurisdiction is statewide, so we don't have those limitations. And, you know, we're contracted out by the state of Connecticut. The security deposit has always been an obstacle I have found with participants being able to afford that upfront dollars. So we do have a security deposit guarantee program here in the state of Connecticut that is also administered by the Department of Housing. And during the crisis in the housing increase of the market, typically those dollars were only allocated to homeless individuals. Well, they expanded that criteria, that acknowledgement to our issued participants to assist them in that. You know, we didn't go as far as assisting landlords with, you know, being able to rehab their properties or, you know, get the units up to HQS. It has been a thought. I think that the biggest obstacle right now for the state is the monitoring of it. But it may be something in the future, which I think is a great initiative. And who do you give it to, who do you don't? So I think those are all of the little things that, you know, the state may be working out right now with trying to gather a pool such as that. But it's funny that Peggy mentioned the fact of using examples. You know, I know I said at the beginning, I'm so sick of saying pre-COVID, post-COVID, you know, it's my timeline is all affiliated with the shutdown and so forth. But excuse me, I have in my brochures with our landlord briefings have added that the mention that Peggy had about during COVID, our voucher landlords, a half portion never stopped. In the private market, there was a moratorium, so landlords in the private market couldn't evict. So how wonderful of a benefit to be participating in such a truly gifted program, because we didn't miss a beat. On the other side, they may have, because like you said too, tenants' rents could have been adjusted for our participants. In the private market, you know, it's a flat rate. They are responsible to pay that lease amount rate. So I have added some blurbages on our flyers to our landlords to represent that, you know, it's a guaranteed source of income to come into their properties so that they can maintain it.
Yeah, thank you. We have some good questions here, a lot of good questions here. And we have about a little less than 15 minutes left. I want to bring Suzanne back in if she's still here. We have a couple of questions about the home ownership component of vouchers and using vouchers, transitioning vouchers from a rental subsidy into the home ownership space, and how folks go about finding more about that and how common that is.
It's actually not a very used program in Connecticut. But in terms of finding more information, they can always email me and I can connect them to the housing authority if they already have to have a voucher. And then in terms of how does it work? I think I explained just very briefly that the voucher, instead of being paid to a landlord, would be paid on behalf of the resident for the mortgage or part of the mortgage. So you'd have to find a house in Connecticut that, the resident has a down payment for and can afford, either with the voucher payment or any supplemental income they may have to relegate to paying mortgage and the other expenses. So it really is a very niche program. It's got to have the perfect combination of a good priced house hopefully in good shape, and people who have either increasing income or maybe participated in a housing authority's family self-sufficiency program and have been able to save for a deposit. But again, anyone who has a question can certainly email me and I can get some information as well as connect them to a housing authority. And Michelle, I don't know if I don't think the state has done this in the past, but if you have anything you want to add from a housing authority perspective.
Agreed with regards to home ownership. We don't have a home ownership program, but we have a very successful FSS program that that's the training I'm actually at with Nan McKay. We have new regulations that were just posted. So I think the FSS program is a wonderful path to getting to home ownership, because the majority of our FSS participants, that is one of their ITSP goals, because it's a goal-oriented program, and they set that goal to be a homeowner. And like you said, I think it's a whole in Connecticut, I think it's difficult for home ownership because our prices of our homes are so high. So there has to be that solid package of the price of the house, the rising income of the individual, and they possibly having enough money to put down for a down payment so that their mortgage percent isn't as astronomically high. And I think it's kind of tough here in Connecticut, and I think a lot of our New England states too, Suzanne.
Yes.
Of the price of our homes being so high. But I think that's the great lead into home ownership, Kylie, is the FSS program. It's a great way for them to generate revenue to put down for,
an FSS, for those of you who aren't in this world, is family self-sufficiency
acronym.
Yep.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of success in FSS beyond home ownership, Kylie. People whose main goal is to buy a home or to start a business. It really is a great goal setting program that we have seen a lot of success in Connecticut on that, using that program.
So lots of questions about coming in about challenges with using vouchers and leasing them up at this time and other tenant-based subsidies. And I'll throw this one to Suzanne to start, that there's an increase in housing discrimination complaints. What's your perspective, Suzanne, on why we're seeing that increase in housing discrimination complaints at this point in time? And others, feel free to jump in on that too.
Well, I think part of it is an educated population. 2 years ago, I look at every month the types of phone calls that come into the head office and by category. And about a year and a half ago, across New England, we weren't getting a lot of fair housing complaints. And in part because, with the exception of New Hampshire, all of our laws are substantially equivalent across New England. So we have our state partners who take those complaints on behalf of HUD. But we have really tried to up that outreach. So I hope that's working. The department's had some advertisements on fair housing. And, we have very strong tenant advocates in Connecticut that support our tenants and educate them that is a path that's available to them to file a fair housing complaint with HUD or in Connecticut CHRO.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? On market conditions or other things that you think may be driving some of those housing discrimination complaints, which are good in one sense, right? We're seeing more people, to Suzanne's point, accessing that agency and pushing for that. But on the other hand, it could be a sign of challenges in the market too.
Oh, Kylie, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm just going to say I'm going to try to get to one or two more questions, but we've got a very long list of some great questions. Some from tenants or folks who are asking specific tenant-based questions, like what is the best way for a tenant on Section 8 to contest a rental increase? And fair rent commissions, we know, are in some places, but we have a new law taking effect in Connecticut where we're going to see more of those. And not sure whether there are other opportunities for folks to contest rental increases. But maybe Felicia or Michelle, if you've seen sort of on the ground experiences with this, what are the best avenues for tenants, particularly in this tough market with rental increases as they are?
That's a tough one, because once again, we have regulations that we have to follow. So, if a tenant is in a dwelling and the landlord asks for an increase, possibly getting him up to the market rent, as long as it meets rent reasonableness, which is one of the key factors. And as we know now, rent reasonableness has increased because the market has increased. I do think the new laws may assist in that. In Connecticut, the fair housing proposed fair rent law that's out there. We really try to negotiate with our owners to keep them at a respectable increase level. I mean, it's not possible with all, but we have seen that when it comes to a point where the gross rent exceeds the payment standard, landlords are more willing to not take as much of an increase because they know that portion, that piece is getting placed on the tenant, especially when they have good tenants in place and they want to keep them in place. They'll take a lesser of an increase as they can. But yeah, that's a struggle. It's a difficult question because, in some attributes, they are eligible for what the market is paying, and unfortunately, not only the rent rates have increased, taxes, property taxes have increased, and, that gets thrown at us all the time too. So we do try to negotiate with the owners to keep them at a reasonable level of an increase in a rental portion.
And I would add to that negotiation, helping the landlord to understand that there is a cost to eviction, there is a cost to having a vacancy, and there's a cost of potentially waiting on someone who does not have a voucher to come and fill that unit. The voucher is a beneficial program to all parties involved, and just really highlighting the beneficial uses of that voucher to the landlord can help to keep a tenant in place.
Kylie, can I add that we get a lot of complaints, not only about the landlord side, but about a resident or voucher holder who doesn't understand why their tenant contribution went up. And what we first instruct those folks to do is to call the housing authority. You recertified, your income may have changed. As Michelle says, pre-pandemic, those were always face-to-face meetings. Now they're not always face-to-face to start. So the first recourse is to contact the housing authority. And if you still don't understand, or if you're not getting answers, then people avail themselves of calling our office all the time, and we try to and get involved, make sure that things, the parties are openly discussing the financial situation and that it's being handled properly. We find mistakes, on both sides, but that's an avenue as well if that's the issue on the tenant contribution and that going up.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne, and thanks, Felicia and Michelle, too. It's helpful information. We only have a couple minutes left. I note that our friends at OCA, Open Communities Alliance, are hosting an event tomorrow for service providers using vouchers. Danielle's going to drop a link to that in the chat if you're interested in learning more from that angle. Final question to each of you, so like 30 seconds. There's some questions in the chat about this too. how do we expand the voucher program, right? We know it's a pool of money, not a set number of subsidies, or I should say the tenant subsidy program, right? Lots of different types of vouchers, lots of different types of tenant subsidies, and we've covered that today. So expanding and adding to those pools is one way to help ameliorate not only the long backlog of tenants, but to help deal with rent increases and that sort of thing. I know there's been talk at the federal level about universal vouchers and those types of and a push for more vouchers, a push for more access to vouchers for more families. I want to ask each of you from your perspective, maybe it is an increase in the program, and I know Home Connecticut here is going to be probably pursuing that on the RAP side this coming session, but what do you feel would be the biggest, most impactful change that could be made to tenant-based subsidy programs, either federal or state, from your perspective? I'll start with Peggy.
So I think we need to start experimenting with ways to make the voucher program look more like cash for families. And we've been thinking about ways to advocate for maybe pilots in this space, but there's also no reason why with state dollars you couldn't experiment with like how to make housing assistance, food assistance looks a lot like cash. Can we make housing assistance look like cash and eliminate a few things that we've talked about, particularly the need for landlords to even know that the family has assistance in the first place. And so that is one idea that I think could help, in addition to obviously advocating at the federal level for vouchers to move from the discretionary side of the budget to the mandatory side of the budget, because discretionary funding constraints puts constraints on how much funding we can get. And so that is going to be necessary in order moving to the mandatory side of the budget is going to be necessary to get to universal assistance.
Yeah, thank you. We often cite SNAP as or food stamps as they're commonly known, right, as a way in which the voucher program could mimic more, right? That if you're eligible for those resources, that you're able to access them and that they act more like cash, which reduces the potential for discrimination. So, that's great. I'd love to see more pilots on that, Peggy. Why don't we jump to Michelle, Felicia, and I'll finish off with Suzanne.
I find that very interesting. I'll be honest with you, I have not heard that, to treat it like cash. I think that sounds very interesting. We're of the notion at DOH, JDA, where it's not a number to us. It's a budget authority. So we go to that budget authority allocation and try to serve as many of the participants and off of the waiting list as we possibly can to get to a higher level. I think sometimes, especially your smaller PHAs, they're reluctant to issue an extra 4 because, they may have already been at that baseline and afraid to get to that budget authority. I mean, we're so much larger than most PHAs that our mindset is it's not a total number. It's all about dollars to us. So the more we can serve, we're also unique in the factor that Fairfield County, which we call our Gold Coast, is extremely expensive. But then you get to where our corporate office is in the New Haven County area of Waterbury, and it's much lower. So using those dynamics of a really extremely high rent in one area and a middle-age rent in another area gets it to a comparable factor so that we can allocate a few more, a dozen more here, a dozen more there to get to our budget authority rather than our UMLs, our baseline of rents out there. But I'm interested to see what comes about the whole thinking of the, rent as a form of cash. That's quite interesting.
Alicia?
So voucher holders have this resource, but they lack opportunity to use it, and then they lack the power. in the position that they're put in. And in order to overcome those last two, we do need increased landlord engagement. I really like that idea, Peggy, of having landlords that participate share their stories about the benefits to the landlords and to the tenants. We also need to use that engagement as an opportunity to educate landlords who are not participants, who think they don't have to accept vouchers, and then also enforce the existing fair housing laws that clearly states discrimination because someone has a voucher is illegal.
Thanks. Suzanne, what about you? What do you think might be the most impactful change in tenant subsidy program?
I just want everyone to know we are doing lots of landlord outreach, trying to get more landlords engaged. We did a huge presentation this last year and we're continuing that this year. So we hear that loud and clear. I think, the need for more housing units, using the funds we have an incredible amount of home ARPA money, which isn't going to get us units tomorrow, but in a year or 2 or 3 years, we could have more units. So pressuring our grantees to get that money on the street is important to create better housing and new options for people. I think educating, we happen to have a very supportive delegation, but I think our delegation needs help sometimes in conveying the success stories, and that's up to housing authorities to make sure they educate their elected officials. I think engaging local mayors that, on a campaign to get more landlords. I mean, we want to house our neighbors, and particularly this time of year, and try to use the flexibilities that we give you and push for more, push us. I mean, I don't know how far we can go. Maybe Peggy has some insight there, having sat in the inner sanctum, but push us and educate us on what you need to make your program successful.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. We actually have a little more time than I thought, but I know that Michelle may have to leave us here shortly. Okay, you can stay good. I want to do 1 or 2 more because we have a lot of great questions here. There's a particularly one about youth that I know that has come up multiple times, and I think it's important to note this. So the question, Peggy, is around youth living in public housing and how once they get a job, their income could potentially put their family's housing in jeopardy. So wanted to know, maybe Peggy, you can kick off with kind of trying to respond to where the discussion is around this particular topic in the federal space.
Yes, so I was really excited about this question, actually, because this is something that HUD has actually talked about, and I sent a link to the host to send to everyone. So the secretary in the summer, I think in August, released an economic justice initiative plan that talks about bridging the wealth gap for renters, and it's sort of centered in what we've learned about the family self-sufficiency program. And one nugget in that I want advocates to pay attention to is number 5 on the list, which is and is detailed more on pages 9 and 10 of the document that that Danielle just put in the chat. Where there are, and so it's about how to help young adults save money. And one of the interesting things I learned about were there are a couple of moving to work agencies. So these are the agencies, PHAs, that have a special designation with HUD to allow them to have some flexibilities on how they use their funding and flexibility and seek flexibilities from HUD in how they administer the program, really. Basically, and a couple of them have an income disregard for youth ages 18 to 21. I think one may go up to 24. So youth who are in school, their incomes can already be disregarded, but young adults, I should say, who are working, that's not who are working and not in school, then that's not necessarily the case. And, to me, this is completely an economic justice issue for low-income families, right? How many people have young adults who you still help them pay some of their bills, or they're living at home and saving money, and you're not required to go after them for rent, even if you do charge them a little rent. And think about the stress that can cause for families alone, and the disincentives to work or to lie, or not report work, things like that. So the 2 MTW agencies that I've talked to. One is Reno, Nevada. The other one is Lawrence, Kansas. The two of them have income disregards for this population, and they both coming at it from different perspectives. One around the incentive to work, one around just mental health and stress for families, but both coming to the conclusion that this is cheap. It is the case managers love it, families love it, and it helps families thrive. Like, this is a no-brainer. And so I think, well, that's one of the great things about the moving to work agencies is the ones that are really being innovative, testing new things. We should be doing more to call out what they're learning so that we can apply those things to the larger voucher program. And I think this is one space that I really hope advocates kind of lean on HUD about and look at this document and then use this as incentive for HUD to do more to advance this kind of strategy. So I'm so glad that folks asked about this.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that question, whoever asked that question. A question here, and this is a question we get often at IForums, is about the challenges that folks exiting our criminal justice system or justice-involved youth face in trying to access different types of public housing subsidies. And so I want to touch on that here, particularly how that interacts or how that population interacts or is able to access different types of tenant-based subsidies. But you can also respond to this more broadly in other types of affordable housing resources. I don't know who wants to jump in on this first.
I'd like to jump in, and unfortunately after this, I do have to get back to my training, but we have a couple of incentives through our state WRAP program with regards to reentry into our communities. They're called FUSE, SIF, and Next Steps. And they're pilot programs where we're not denying applicants because of their convictions of their criminal history. We're actually using that as a guide where we're surveying to see, once they get into a suitable, affordable unit, is this helping them to have less of a criminal activity in the future? And the programs have gone very, very well. There is support case management, of course, attached to it. Each of the different pilot programs have a different length of time. I'm not sure anybody out there have the CHESS program, but we're also doing another pilot program right now through our state WRAP program called CHESS is the acronym it was named here in Connecticut. And it's a data match between DOC and the state's DSS system and DOH. So 3 state agencies partnered up, and those that have frequent incarceration periods, we're giving them, we call them WRAP certificates. Back in the day, the old voucher certificate, we still call our WRAPs the certificates, but we're giving them the affordability factor of dwelling so that they can remain housed, because we have found over the course of the last 2 years from this program that a lot of the engaging in criminal activity is due to not having an affordable unit or a unit period for those individuals. And it's been a very large success, and they're talking about extending it for another 100 folks to get them, back into the community. I know there's a lot of PHAs that, have mixed feelings about putting convicted felons into their properties, especially in their elderly developments, which is why we have adopted policies. But, if we see that something is possibly working in, rather than a unit-based setting, into a tenant-based setting, maybe that's the way to go, so that they're not all in one development. Maybe it's scattered, and that, that stigma isn't on those individuals renting the units. But so far, it's been a great success. So we're excited.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Peggy, Felicia, Suzanne, anything you want to add about justice involved population and access to tenant resources?
I think I just want to mention that a number of our housing authorities do have reentry programs. We are educating them all the time on that, except for the statutory exceptions, to try to look at people, who may have had a justice involved background, but, are perfectly capable of living well under a voucher or their public housing programs and our multifamily programs as well. And that we try to ask people to look as liberally as possible. And we recognize that with all of our populations, a stable household and roof over their head is the first step to success in life. So we are always educating, our partners on trying to be as broad as possible, and certainly as fair within our fair housing laws too.
Thanks. Anything else anyone want to add on that before we move on? So we'll just conclude just a couple minutes here with anything else that I didn't ask you, or anything else that you wanted to share, either about your experience working with folks directly or the programs, common misconceptions you want to correct. Here's your opportunity. So any sort of last words or thoughts that you wanted to offer or information you want to share around tenant-based subsidies before we close things out. Why don't we start with Felicia, since we haven't heard from you in a bit, and then we'll go back to Peggy and Susie.
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for having me today. I enjoyed being a part of this panel discussion. And, tenant-based subsidies, they are a win-win for all parties involved. But along with that, I would like to add that we do need to increase our affordable housing stock, just as Suzanne mentioned earlier. With 2% vacancy, it's very difficult. We need more units in general, specifically more affordable and supportive housing units throughout the state.
Thanks, Peggy.
I think what I would say is, to piggyback off of Felicia, is also, doing a real examination on where voucher holders are living, making sure that we're not forcing segregation of people into communities that have been disinvested in, or that aren't meeting their needs, and doing all that we can to make sure that voucher holders have true choice of the community in which they can live is critical, because that's, as was mentioned at the top, a key component of the voucher program is ideally people should be able to live wherever in their community of choice, but we're not doing enough to ensure that that's the case.
Suzanne, anything you want to add?
Just don't be afraid to ask questions. If something doesn't make sense or it's an urban myth, I'm an email junkie, so send your questions in, we'll get them answered. Don't sit or if you don't understand something or how a regulation is being applied, don't be afraid to ask. Please just, avail yourselves of our head office.
Right. A lot of those challenges with vouchers that we're experiencing. We had, I think, a good conversation about today about how to ameliorate some of the both administrative challenges that we're been looking at here in the state. Looking to our success with EHV and paperwork reduction is one of those, as well as increasing the pool of resources, conversation at the federal level, and moving towards a conversation around using vouchers more like cash, or treating them more like cash, from Peggy, and all sorts of other great examples. Thanks for Felicia too for bringing in all of your great experience on the ground in Stonington and at CSH. And Suzanne, thank you so much for your presentation earlier here. That will be posted as well. And please see the chat too for Peggy's most recent published article. I'd like to note also that the partnership publishes resources around a host of topics on housing, a lot of one-pagers and briefs that can help provide more information. And we do have some resources on the rental assistance program here in Connecticut, or RAPS, that we've been talking about today. And those are available at pschousing.org. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. I'm going to close us out with a big thank you again to Peggy, Suzanne, Felicia, Michelle, who's not here, and Steve, who unfortunately was unable to join us. Thank you all for your time and for sharing your expertise and knowledge. Thanks all of you who joined and asked some really fabulous questions. I'm going to try to farm some of those out to our speakers after the fact that we didn't get to today. But thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.